Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're tackling, well, a couple of really fundamental questions in biology. What exactly is a species?
And how are they all related? They sound simple, almost like first-year textbook stuff.
Right, but the answers. They unpack centuries of debate, philosophy, science. It's quite a journey.
It really is.
So if you're aiming to get a solid grasp on these core ideas quickly, defining life, how we classify it, from ancient Greece to modern genetics, this deep dive using your source material is definitely for you.
Our mission, essentially, is to trace how the idea of a species has evolved over time.
And that story starts way back, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely. Deep in antiquity. It's crucial, I think, to realize this isn't just some modern scientific squabble. People were trying to classify life way back with the Greek philosophers, 4th, 5th centuries BCE.
And their ideas really stuck around.
For millennia, their whole framework, this notion of a perfect ideal behind everything we see, cast a really long shadow.
Okay, so let's start there. Plato's idealism. He thought the physical world, everything we touch and see, was just imperfect shadows.
Kind of, yeah. Imperfect copies of these perfect unseen forms. Think about a perfect circle. You can't actually draw one, right? It's always a bit wobbly.
But the concept of a perfect circle exists.
Exactly. And Plato applied that to nature. Every species had this perfect, unchanging blueprint, which, naturally connected science to religions, suggesting conscious design.
Yeah, and Aristotle came along and tweaked it a bit.
He did. He sort of brought the ideal form down to earth, placing it within the organism itself, and this led to teleology.
Teleology, that's the idea that things have a purpose, a goal.
Precisely. Natural processes are goal-oriented. An acorn isn't just a seed. Its purpose, its telos, is to become an oak tree. That future adult form explains the changes the acorn goes through. Nature has direction.
And this idea of fixed forms and inherent purpose led to things like the great chain of being.
Right, the scala naturae. You see it pop up strongly in the 18th century with folks like Charles Bonnet. It's this ladder, this hierarchy from the simplest, least perfect things up to the most complex, most perfect.
And that reinforced ideas about archetypes, like Goethe's universal plant.
Exactly, the Bauplane. Goethe's Erbpflanz was this idea of a single ancestral plant form, and all the diversity we see, well, it was just variations on that core theme, like different modifications of a leaf.
It's fascinating how long that static view held, even Linnaeus.
Carl Linnaeus, yeah, the absolute father of modern taxonomy. His system from the 1700s, incredibly organized, hierarchical. We still use its structure today.
But he was operating within that same framework.
Completely. His goal was classification, yes, but it was classifying the creator's wisdom, the fixed, unchanging species created perfectly from the start.
Okay, so that's the backdrop. Fixed ideals, hierarchy. Then comes the shakeup. Mid-18th century, Georges Buffon.
Buffon? He really threw a wrench in the works, or at least started asking the hard questions. Linnaeus gave us the how of classification, but Buffon started poking at the what.
He still believed species were real and unchanging, though.
He did. For him, species were the only truly natural grouping. But, and this is the revolutionary part, he moved beyond just looks. He proposed that the real test for a species was reproductive isolation.
Ah, the ability to interbreed and produce offspring.
Viable and crucially fertile offspring. If two groups could mate and produce fertile young, they were the same species. If not, if the mating failed or the offspring were sterile, like a mule, then they were distinct species.
That sounds pretty modern, actually, like the basis for the biological species concept.
It absolutely is. But here's the twist. Buffon used this very concept to argue against evolution.
How did that work?
Well, he had a few key arguments that were quite persuasive at the time, lasting well into the 19th century. First, he said, look around, nobody's ever actually seen a new species pop into existence in recorded history.
Okay, point one, no observations of new species.
Point two, mating between different species either doesn't work or produces sterile hybrids. Think mules again. This seemed to prove that the species barrier was absolute, fixed.
Right, proof of distinctness.
And third, he pointed to the lack of intermediate forms, the missing links. Where were the creatures halfway between, say, an ape and a human? Though people like Edward Tyson had done early comparative anatomy, Buffon felt the gaps were too large.
So, fixed species, defined by reproductive isolation, but no evolution.
That was Buffon. Now, contrast him sharply with Lamarck, who came a bit later.
Lamarck had a completely different take, didn't he?
Totally different. For Lamarck, species weren't fixed at all. He thought they were kind of arbitrary points on a continuous line of change. He had a transformational view.
Meaning one species literally turns into another.
Yes, climbing that great chain of being. He didn't really believe in extinction either. Species just evolved into something else, driven by the inheritance of acquired characters. You know, the giraffe stretching its neck and passing that trait on.
Okay, so we have Buffon's fixity versus Lamarck's transformation. Where does Darwin fit in?
Darwin brought in something crucial that neither Buffon nor Lamarck fully captured. His theory wasn't just transformational, it was variational and involved branching.
Branching.
Yes. Lamarck saw a lineage changing over time. Darwin saw a lineage potentially splitting. His theory included both the origin of new species and extinction, but critically, he realized that an ancestral species could give rise to a new one without disappearing itself. They could coexist.
Ah, so you get a branching tree, not just a single ladder.
Exactly. That's a fundamental shift. And to manage this growing complexity, Linnaeus' system became even more vital.
Right back to Linnaeus, he gave us the structure.
Precise descriptions, grouping similar species into a genus, plural genera, and that brilliant two-part naming system, binomial nomenclature.
Homo sapiens, Escherichia coli, that system.
That's the one. And importantly, he shifted classification criteria away from superficial things like lifestyle.
Like the flying fish example.
Perfect example. Before, people might have grouped it weirdly because it flew. Linnaeus looked at its fundamental structure, gills, fins, scales, and said, nope, it's a fish. That focus on core structure was key.
But that focus also created a sort of legacy issue, the typological concept.
Yeah, it reinforced the idea that each species had a perfect type. Taxonomists would designate a specific type specimen in a museum, and every other discovery was compared back to that single example. It subtly kept the old ideal alive, even if unintentionally.
Which brings us closer to the modern problem. How do we define a species today? Because it seems like that single type idea doesn't quite cut it with evolution.
It really doesn't. Since Darwin, biologists realized life is messy and evolution is ongoing, so no single definition works perfectly for everything. We ended up with multiple concepts. Your source material lays out 4 main ones.
Okay, so we have the famous biological species concept, Mayr's idea. Why isn't that enough? Why do we need others?
Because it has serious limitations. But let's walk through the 4. First, the simplest, maybe the most intuitive, the morphological species concept, or morphospecies.
Based on looks.
Pretty much. If individuals share more physical characteristics with each other than they do with other organisms, we call them a species. It's practical.
And essential for fossils, I imagine, when looks are all you have?
Exactly. Paleontological species are basically defined morphologically. And it's powerful. Think about whales, cetaceans. For ages, their relationship to other mammals was murky.
Right.
But morphological analysis of early whale fossils, things like the ankle bone structure, combined later with molecular data, showed they actually belong inside the artiodactyls, the even-toed ungulates, like hippos. Morphology helped bridge that gap.
Okay, so morphospecies works for fossils and general identification. Then, the big one, Mayr's biological species concept, BSC, from 1942.
Right. Defined by reproductive isolation, a group of actually or potentially interbreeding populations which are reproductively isolated from other such groups. No gene flow between them.
The gold standard for animals, maybe?
For many sexually reproducing animals, yes, but huge buts.
Yeah.
It's useless for fossils, obviously. They can't interbreed.
Okay, fails for fossils.
Fails for organisms that reproduce asexually. Think bacteria, many protists, some plants that just clone themselves. Where's the interbreeding?
Good point. No sex, no BSC.
And it gets really messy with plants and fungi, where hybridization between different species is common, and the hybrids are often perfectly viable and fertile. The lines get incredibly blurry.
So the BSC, while useful, leaves a lot out.
A huge amount. And it leads to situations like sibling species. These are groups that look almost identical, morphologically indistinguishable, but they are reproductively isolated.
Like those European tree creepers or the African elephant.
Exactly. The forest elephant, Loxodon cyclotis, and the savanna elephant, L. africana. They look quite similar, maybe some subtle differences, but genetics showed they've been separated for millions of years. Minimal gene flow.
Which pushes towards a more genetic definition.
Precisely. This has led to the genetic species concept, which relies purely on molecular data to define boundaries based on genetic divergence, regardless of looks or even potential interbreeding.
Okay, concept 3.
The evolutionary species concept, proposed by George Gaylord Simpson back in 1961. This one tries to incorporate time explicitly.
How so?
It defines a species as a lineage, an ancestor-descendant sequence of populations evolving separately from others, with its own unique evolutionary role and tendencies.
That sounds a bit Abstract. Unitary evolutionary rule.
It is a bit. But the core idea is that a species isn't just defined by who it can mate with now, but by its distinct historical path and its independent evolutionary future. It acknowledges that species change over time.
Right. It's about the whole trajectory, not just a snapshot. And the last one.
The phylogenetic species concept, or phylospecies, this one is arguably the strictest, focusing purely on evolutionary history, the branching pattern.
How does it define a species?
As the smallest diagnosable cluster of individual organisms that share a unique, identifiable pattern of ancestry and descent. Basically, it defines a species based on unique, shared, derived traits that mark it as a distinct branch on the evolutionary tree. It aims for maximum resolution, identifying potentially many more species than, say, the BSC.
Okay, so 4 concepts, each useful in different contexts. Now, how do we actually map out the relationships between these species beyond the basic Linnaean ranks, kingdom, phylum, class, etc.?
Which we know don't always reflect true evolutionary history, right? Some traditional groups are a bit messy.
Like arthropoda, maybe.
Or reptiles.
Reptiles is the classic example we'll get to. The modern approach, the rigorous way to map evolutionary relationships, is cladistics, or phylogenetic systematics, championed by Willi Henning.
Cladistics focuses on branching patterns.
Exactly. It's all about figuring out the branching order based on shared characteristics. But not just any shared characteristics. Cladistics makes a crucial distinction between plesiomorphic traits, ancestral features inherited from a distant ancestor, and shared widely. Like having a backbone in vertebrates, lots of groups have that.
Precisely. And epimorphic traits, newly derived features that are unique to a particular group and its descendants.
Okay, ancestral versus derived.
And the key for building the evolutionary tree, the cladogram, lies in a specific type of apomorphy, the synapomorphy.
Shared derived characters.
Bingo. These are the evolutionary novelties, new traits that are shared by 2 or more groups because their common ancestor evolved that trait and they inherited it. Those are the traits that tell you about close relationships.
So you ignore the ancestral traits and focus only on the new shared ones.
Pretty much. And cladistics is very strict about how you group organisms based on this. The goal is to define monophyletic groups, or clades.
Monophyletic, meaning?
Meaning a group that includes the common ancestor and all of his descendants. Every single one, no exceptions. Think of it like a complete family photo.
Oh.
The founding parents and all their kids, grandkids, great-grandkids, everyone descended from them.
Okay, ancestor and all descendants. What happens if a group doesn't meet that standard? Like your reptilia example.
Ah, yes. That's where cladistics really shakes up traditional taxonomy. A group like the traditional class Reptilia, which includes turtles, lizards, snakes, crocodiles, is not monophyletic if you leave out birds.
Because birds evolved from dinosaurs, which are reptiles.
Exactly. Birds are descendants of the common ancestor of all those other reptiles. So if you define Reptilia without including aves, birds, you've created what's called a paraphyletic group. You've got the ancestor, but you've artificially excluded some descendants.
And cladistic says that's not a valid group.
Correct. Under strict cladistics, paraphyletic groups are invalid taxa because they don't reflect the complete evolutionary history. So to make Reptilia monophyletic, you must include birds.
So birds are reptiles or dinosaurs?
Technically, yes. From a cladistic viewpoint, aves are a subgroup within Dinosauria, which is within Reptilia or Sauropsida, depending on the specific classification. Yeah. It forces a fundamental shift in how we view these familiar groups.
Wow. Okay, so how do scientists figure out which branching pattern, which cladogram is the right one, especially with, say, tons of DNA data?
Good question. There are competing hypotheses, different possible trees. The classic method is parsimony.
Parsimony, like Occam's razor. The simplest explanation.
Basically, yes. The parsimony method selects the tree that requires the fewest evolutionary changes, the minimum number of mutations or character state shifts to explain the data you have.
Makes sense. Keep it simple.
It's a powerful principle. But with huge data sets, especially molecular data, we often need more statistical muscle. So modern methods like maximum likelihood estimation and Bayesian inference are widely used.
Those sound more complex.
They are. They use sophisticated probability models. Maximum likelihood asks, given this specific evolutionary model, what tree structure makes observing our actual data most probable? Bayesian methods do something similar but incorporate prior information and give probabilities for different trees. They offer more statistical rigor for complex data sets.
Okay, so that's the toolkit for figuring out relationships. Let's try to wrap this up. We've gone from fixed ideals to a whole suite of species concepts and rigorous ways to map evolutionary history.
We really have.
Yeah.
We started with Plato's perfect forms, moved through Linnaeus's organized but static view, saw the stirrings of change with Buffon and Lamarck, hit the Darwinian revolution, and now grapple with multiple ways to define a species and map its history using cladistics.
And the big takeaway seems to be there's no single perfect definition of a species.
Pretty much. The right definition really depends on the organisms you're studying and the questions you're asking. Are you a paleontologist with only bones? Morphospecies it is. Studying gene flow in birds, the BSC is relevant. Trying to capture the entire evolutionary lineage. Maybe the evolutionary or phylogenetic concept is better.
It's that tension, isn't it? We often use morphology for the day-to-day work of identifying things.
Because it's practical.
But understanding the deep reality of evolution requires thinking about reproductive isolation, genetic divergence, and these long-term independent lineages.
Exactly. It's about recognizing both the practical need for labels and the dynamic, ongoing process of evolution.
Well, thank you for sharing your source material with us. This has been a truly illuminating exploration of concepts that are, well, fundamental to all of biology.
My pleasure. And maybe here's a final thought for you, the listener, to
Yeah.
chew on. Something that stems directly from all this.
Okay.
Given that speciation isn't an instant event, it's a process. If we define a species as a lineage, evolving separately, tracing its own path, how long does that path have to be? How separate does it need to become? How much divergence is enough before we can confidently point to it and say, okay, now that's a new species? Where do you draw the line in a continuous process?
That's a tricky one. Something to think about.